The Yonaguni Monument is a submerged rock formation located off the coast of Yonaguni Island, Japan, discovered by a diver in 1986. Its sharp edges and step shapes prompted immediate debate. The implication is possible human modification, while the limitation is that discovery occurred outside an archaeological context. The structure lies approximately 25 meters below sea level in the East China Sea. This depth implies submersion after formation. The limitation is determining whether submersion occurred before or after any potential human activity. The monument consists of large flat surfaces, right angles, and terrace-like formations. These features imply intentional design. The limitation is that similar geometries can occur naturally in fractured sandstone. Marine geologist Masahaki Kimura has argued that the structure shows evidence of carving and human alteration. This implies prehistoric construction. The limitation is that Kimura's interpretation is disputed among geologists. Other scientists classify Yonaguni as a natural formation shaped by tectonic activity and erosion. This implies geological origin. The limitation is explaining the regularity and scale of some features. Yonaguni Island lies in a seismically active region. This context implies frequent fracturing along natural plains. The limitation is that tectonic fractures alone may not account for all observed patterns. The rock is composed primarily of sandstone and mudstone, which fracture predictably. This supports natural explanations. The limitation is that predictability does not rule out modification. Some surfaces appear unusually smooth and planar. This implies potential shaping. The limitation is that underwater erosion can also produce smooth plains. The monument includes what appear to be stair-like steps. This suggests architectural intent. The limitation is that step-like erosion occurs in layered rock formations. No artifacts such as tools, pottery, or human remains have been found at the site. This absence challenges human construction theories. The limitation is that underwater contexts reduce artifact survival. Estimates suggest the structure would have been above sea level over 10,000 years ago. This implies extreme antiquity if man-made. The limitation is uncertainty in sea level reconstruction. If constructed by humans, the monument would predate known Japanese civilizations. This implication challenges archaeological timelines. The limitation is lack of corroborating evidence elsewhere. The surrounding seabed contains scattered rocks with similar features. This suggests broader geological processes. The limitation is distinguishing central structure from surroundings. Divers report straight edges extending for dozens of meters. This scale implies planning. The limitation is human perception can overinterpret geometric forms. Photographic and video documentation varies in quality. This affects analysis. The limitation is that distortion underwater can misrepresent shapes. No inscriptions or carvings, clearly identifiable as symbolic, have been documented. This absence limits cultural attribution. The limitation is that erosion may have removed markings. The monument's discovery sparked comparisons to other submerged sites worldwide. This implies global patterns. The limitation is that comparisons do not establish connection. Some proponents suggest Yonaguni represents a sunken city or ceremonial center. This implies complex society. The limitation is absence of settlement evidence. Critics argue that labeling natural formations as artificial reflects pattern recognition bias. This implies cognitive influence. The limitation is separating bias from observation. Japanese authorities have not classified Yonaguni as a confirmed archaeological site. This reflects institutional caution. The limitation is that classification depends on evidence thresholds. Underwater surveys have mapped the structure in detail. This provides data. The limitation is that mapping alone cannot determine origin. The monument's sharp edges contrast with rounded features nearby. This implies selective processes. The limitation is geological heterogeneity. Sediment buildup on some surfaces suggests long-term submersion. This implies age. The limitation is dating sediment accurately. No definitive tool marks have been identified. This challenges carving theories. The limitation is that tool marks erode over millennia. The site remains accessible only to experienced divers. This limits study. The limitation is restricted observation time. Media portrayals often exaggerate artificiality. This shapes public belief. The limitation is distortion of scientific debate. Scholarly articles remain divided on interpretation. This implies unresolved status. The limitation is lack of decisive evidence. Yonaguni exists at the intersection of geology and archaeology. This complicates analysis. The limitation is disciplinary boundary. The monument's regular forms continue to challenge simple explanations. This sustains inquiry. The limitation is interpretive ambiguity. At this contextual stage, the Yonaguni Monument is defined by striking geometry, competing interpretations, and absence of definitive proof. The implication is unresolved origin, while the limitation remains clear. Evidence supports multiple explanations. Subsequent investigations have attempted to isolate features that could only result from human activity. This implies a methodological approach. The limitation is that criteria for distinguishing artificial from natural underwater formations remain debated. Detailed surveys show that many edges align with natural bedding planes in the rock. This supports geological explanations. The limitation is that alignment does not exclude later modification. Some flat surfaces appear unusually extensive compared to surrounding formations. This implies selective shaping. The limitation is that erosion can preferentially remove softer material. Kimura and colleagues identified what they interpret as carved channels and depressions. This implies functional design. The limitation is that similar features can arise from water flow and abrasion. Other geologists argue that fractures follow predictable right angles in sandstone under tectonic stress. This explains geometric forms. The limitation is explaining the apparent repetition of such features. Comparative studies with known underwater ruins emphasize the absence of associated debris at Yonaguni. This challenges artificial origin claims. The limitation is that debris disperses easily underwater. No evidence of habitation, such as anchors or domestic artifacts, has been recovered. This implies non-residential context. The limitation is that absence of evidence is not conclusive. Sea level rise after the last glacial maximum submerged many coastal features. This implies Yonaguni could predate flooding. The limitation is that dating submersion does not date construction. Radiometric dating of the rock itself reflects geological age, not shaping. This limits chronological analysis. The implication is methodological constraint. Some researchers propose that Yonaguni represents a naturally formed structure later used by humans. This implies hybrid use. The limitation is lack of material traces, confirming human interaction. Diver reports describe staircases leading to flat platforms. This implies navigability. The limitation is that human interpretation influences perception. The monument's scale suggests any construction would require significant labor. This implies organized society. The limitation is absence of corroborating archaeological evidence on land. Japanese prehistoric sites on nearby islands show no matching architectural tradition. This weakens construction theories. The limitation is incomplete archaeological coverage. Ocean currents around Yonaguni are strong, accelerating erosion. This supports natural shaping. The limitation is assessing erosion rates over millennia. Some scholars emphasize caution in labeling features as stairs or walls. This implies semantic bias. The limitation is that descriptive language shapes interpretation. Photogrammetry has improved three-dimensional modeling of the site. This aids analysis. The limitation is that models still require interpretation. The monument's isolation complicates comparative study. This limits contextualization. The limitation is singularity. Public fascination often frames Yonaguni as evidence of lost civilizations. This influences discourse. The limitation is separation of popular narrative from evidence. Academic consensus currently favors a natural origin with unusual geometry. This reflects majority interpretation. The limitation is acknowledgement of unresolved anomalies. Some features remain difficult to explain purely through erosion. This sustains debate. The limitation is that difficulty does not equal artificiality. The lack of consensus highlights disciplinary differences between geology and archaeology. This affects conclusions. The limitation is methodological divergence. Funding and access limitations restrict long-term study. This slows progress. The limitation is resource constraint. Yonaguni challenges assumptions about pattern recognition in archaeology. This has broader implications. The limitation is subjective interpretation. Experimental geology attempts to replicate similar forms through natural processes. This suggests plausibility. The limitation is replicating exact conditions. The monument's continued exposure to erosion alters its features. This complicates longitudinal study. The limitation is ongoing change. Some researchers call for reframing the debate away from binary classification. This implies nuanced understanding. The limitation is reduced clarity. Yonaguni remains an instructive case in interdisciplinary investigation. This broadens significance. The limitation is unresolved origin. Each new survey refines measurements, but not conclusions. This underscores limits of data. The limitation is interpretive ceiling. The monument's ambiguity sustains scientific interest. This keeps inquiry active. The limitation is absence of decisive evidence. At this investigative stage, Yonaguni continues to be interpreted through competing geological and archaeological frameworks. The implication is persistent uncertainty, while the limitation remains unchanged. Material evidence does not confirm human construction. The ongoing debate over Yonaguni reflects how extraordinary formations test disciplinary boundaries. Geologists and archaeologists apply different standards of evidence. The limitation is that no shared framework exists to definitively resolve cases that sit between natural formation and potential modification. Comparisons with other submerged sites often emphasize context rather than form. This implies that associated artifacts are crucial. The limitation is that Yonaguni lacks such contextual materials. The monument's sharp angles continue to attract attention because they contrast with expectations of underwater erosion. This implies anomaly. The limitation is that expectations are based on general patterns, not absolute rules. Human perception tends to identify familiar shapes in complex environments. This cognitive tendency implies risk of misinterpretation. The limitation is separating perception from physical process. Some researchers argue that if Yonaguni were artificial, evidence should exist on nearby land. This implies integrated settlement. The limitation is that coastal sites are especially vulnerable to erosion and loss. The structure's isolation offshore complicates logistical explanations for construction. This implies improbability. The limitation is that improbability alone does not disprove occurrence. Underwater archaeology faces inherent constraints, including limited visibility and time. This affects data quality. The limitation is incomplete observation. Yonaguni's case highlights how absence of artifacts weighs heavily against human construction theories. This reflects archaeological standards. The limitation is that standards are based on terrestrial sites. Geological processes can create forms that mimic human architecture. This complicates interpretation. The limitation is distinguishing mimicry from intention. Some proponents suggest that future discoveries elsewhere may contextualize Yonaguni retroactively. This implies deferred understanding. The limitation is reliance on hypothetical findings. Scientific caution prioritizes conservative explanations when evidence is ambiguous. This favors natural origin. The limitation is potential underestimation of rare human activity. Yonaguni continues to be cited in discussions about submerged landscapes after the last ice age. This broadens relevance. The limitation is speculative linkage. The monument's endurance under erosion suggests structural robustness. This implies material strength. The limitation is that robustness applies to both natural and artificial structures. Debate persists partly because the site cannot be excavated in the traditional sense. This limits intervention. The limitation is methodological constraint. The question of intent remains central. Natural processes have no intent. Human builders do. This distinction defines the debate. The limitation is that intent leaves indirect traces. Yonaguni demonstrates how geology can challenge archaeological intuition. This informs interdisciplinary humility. The limitation is unresolved classification. The site has influenced public imagination more than academic consensus. This affects discourse. The limitation is divergence between perception and evidence. Scholarly publications emphasize uncertainty rather than definitive claims. This reflects responsible practice. The limitation is lack of closure. The monument's ambiguity ensures continued research interest. This sustains study. The limitation is diminishing likelihood of resolution. Over time, erosion may further obscure defining features. This reduces future clarity. The limitation is irreversible change. Yonaguni's debate illustrates how scientific disagreement can persist without resolution. This informs understanding of inquiry. The limitation is acceptance of uncertainty. The absence of new decisive data reinforces conservative interpretations. This stabilizes consensus. The limitation is reliance on existing evidence. The monument challenges assumptions about what constitutes proof of human construction. This prompts reflection. The limitation is definitional ambiguity. Yonaguni remains a reference point in discussions of natural versus artificial structures. This sustains relevance. The limitation is unresolved origin. The case underscores the importance of context over form in archaeology. This shapes methodology. The limitation is that context may be permanently lost. Without associated cultural material, classification remains provisional. This constrains conclusions. The limitation is evidentiary silence. Yonaguni's features continue to resist definitive categorization. This defines its mystery. The limitation is interpretive balance. The monument's significance lies as much in the debate it generates as in the structure itself. This reframes importance. The limitation is meta-analysis. The lack of consensus reflects the limits of current methods. This informs future research priorities. The limitation is present capability. The facts are real. The explanation is up to you.